to participate. One. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing the Lord forever. I will sing. I will sing. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord. I will not, will I make known thy faithfulness, thy faithfulness. With my mouth will I make known thy faithfulness to all generations. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing. I will sing. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord. All right. Thank you.
Well, yeah, there we go. Okay. I picked a topic tonight. It was suggested that I do this tonight, so I picked a topic that I thought would be apropos, and it has to do with being a good neighbor. And I think that we all feel that all this that's going on in our nation is pretty well indicative of needing this particular sermon. So that's why I picked it. If you'd like to follow, it's the topic is, and I'd like to thank several people for this because I've had a lot of help on this. I started following part of James Merritt, and then I also had Jay Anderson, who was here. He gave me a lot of good ideas, and of course Larry and Chuck it's been a very unique experience for me, to say the least. The preparation and all was very good for me. It's very testing, let's put it that way. And we'll be in Luke 10:25 through 37. If you've ever watched the President of the United States deliver a State of the Union address in recent years, you know that at some point in the speech, he'll point to a balcony and he'll pick out someone special. Typically, it's someone that he considers a real hero. What you may not know is that was started by Ronald Reagan back in '90, and he introduced a man by the name of Lenny Skutnik. And to this day, reporters, before the State of the Union, will go to and ask the presidential aides the question, "Who are the Skutniks this year?" Lenny Skutnik was a federal worker walking down the street minding his own business until the day the Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the Potomac River. The flight had just taken off from Washington bound for Florida and had developed ice on the wings, and it brought it down, and he could not clear the he tried to clear the Washington 14th Street Bridge, but didn't make it. That's why it went into the Potomac. In the next few moments, several passengers were thrown into the river. A helicopter soon came by, dropping down ropes, trying to pick up as many people as it could, except for there was one lady that just could not struggle to grab the ladder. She couldn't grab the rope, and she was being, I guess, people were trying to get her to grab it. They were giving her all kinds of encouragement. But Lenny Skutnik saw what was going on, and he broke through the police barrier, and he dove into the river, and he saved her life, drug her, got her back up on the deal, got her back onto land. And she was so cold and frozen she couldn't even lift her arms when she was in the water, so she couldn't be saved. I mean, she had to be saved. Okay. The President of the United States called him a hero, but Lord Jesus Christ would call him a good neighbor. Okay, that's what he was, is a good neighbor or not. And of all the stories Jesus told along with the prodigal son, perhaps the most famous story is the Good Samaritan. This is a story that is directly related to the Lenny Skutniks of the world, and the story begins with a lawyer asking a good question with a bad motive. And behold, verse 25, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, everyone ought to be asking the question, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Because I believe that is life's greatest question. That is, how can I know for sure when I die I will go to heaven? That's the question. But in this instance, Jesus does not answer the question. Instead, he asks a question. Verse 26, he said to him, "What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?" Now, there is a reason Jesus did not give the man a direct answer to his question. This man was not seeking information. We read here that he's simply trying to test Jesus. That is, he was trying to trap him. You'll find in the Bible that when anyone came to Jesus with an honest question, he always gave them an honest answer. But when they came to him with a dishonest question, he would always turn the tables and by asking them a question. And the gist of that is, you just don't test Jesus, he tests you. This lawyer replies to Jesus' question with a perfect answer. So he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord with your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live." Now, at first, I'm sure there was a very smug, satisfied smile on the face of the lawyer, knowing he'd given the right answer, but the smile didn't last very long. The lawyer soon realized that he had dug a hole and fallen into it, because even though Jesus affirmed the answer He followed up with another question, and he said to him, "You've answered rightly. Do this, and you will live." Verse 28 through 29, 28, 29. But he wanted to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" You see, like a good lawyer, he was looking for a loophole. He was trying to separate people into two categories, neighbors and non-neighbors, and he gave Jesus a golden opportunity to tell of his greatest stories, to teach one of the greatest lessons, and to shock the world at the same time. Verse 30, then Jesus answered and said, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among the thieves, who stripped him of clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead." The Jericho road is a 17-mile, very narrow, dangerous, winding road that is bordered by steep cliffs on one side and barren hills on the other. Even to this day, if it rains quite a bit, the road is impassable. As a matter of fact, the road was so dangerous that in those days it was called the Way of the Blood. The Way of Blood. But it was dangerous for another reason. Bible scholars estimate that there were at least 12,000 thieves in that Judean wilderness surrounding Jerusalem. These gangs and thugs roamed the countryside like packs of wild dogs, attacking innocent victims, beating them, and robbing them. So here was a man who had been victimized by some thieves, and not only robbed, but beaten and left for dead. Now Jesus introduces in his story three characters: the thieves, the priest, and the Levite, and the Good Samaritan. These people tell us what kind of neighbor we really are to other people, and what kind of attitude dictates how we see others and how we treat others. Following is three categories that exemplify these people. The first one being lust. What is yours is mine, I will take it. Does that sound familiar? Especially right now? Okay. Now, there's an attitude that most people in the world have today which could be categorized as lust. Simply put, it says, what is yours is mine, I'll take it. There are far more thieves than you might realize. The robber who takes money that does not belong to him is a thief. The rapist who takes sexual pleasure from someone not his spouse is a thief. The adulterer who seeks another man's wife is a thief. Corporate executives and CEOs who bilk innocent stockholders of billions of dollars are thieves. But you can be a thief in more than one way. You might be a thief here today and not even realize it. Let me give you a definition of a thief you may never have heard before. God has given us both things and people. God has given us things to use, and God has given us people to love. But when you begin to love things and use people, you become a thief. If you are by nature either a taker, that is, you take things that don't belong to you, or as you're going to see in a moment, are you a keeper, where you don't share things that belong to you? In other words, you are either a taker or a keeper, but you are not a giver. Then you are also a thief. If your attitude is what's in it for me, you're probably a thief. If your attitude is, I want my needs met, I don't care about others, you're probably a thief. If you say, I want it my way and I don't care what happens to others, you're probably a thief. If your attitude is just make sure I get mine, I don't care about anyone else, you're probably a thief. There's a story about a little boy who opened the refrigerator and found his last piece of his mother's award-winning chocolate cake. The only problem was it was had his little brother's name on it. Well, he took it out, took off his brother's name, and began eating the cake fast as he could. Just as the last bite disappeared into his mouth, his mother walked in the kitchen and said, "Derek, I cannot believe you would eat the whole piece of cake without thinking one time about your little brother." He said, "Oh, I was thinking about him the whole time I was eating. I kept worrying he would come in before I could finish it all." Well, if you happen to be a thief, either with your hands or with your heart, let me warn you of something. Thieves are never satisfied with what they steal, because if they were, they would not continue stealing. For more than an hour, a scrawny man sat in a bar staring into a glass. Suddenly, a big burly man walked in, sat down next to him, grabbed the guy's drink, gulped it down immediately. This poor little fellow just burst out crying. The trucker says, "Hey, buddy, I was just joking with you. I'll buy you another drink." The man said, "Oh, that's not my problem. This has been the worst day of my life. I was late for work. I got fired. When I left the office, I found my car had been stolen. I had to walk 6 miles home. When I walked in the door, I found my wife with another man. So I just came over here and decided to end it all. Then you show up and drink my poison." See, there's an attitude that says, I do what I want to do no matter how it affects other people. And they look at others and say, what's yours is mine. I'll take it. They're controlled by lust. Go ahead, Larry. Legalism. What is mine, and I will keep it. I'm sorry that's so small. That's the Indian and not the error. I did that, so okay. Larry tried to correct it for me, but he couldn't get it corrected. Okay. Now Jesus moves on to the second major player in this act, verse 31-32. Now by chance a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed on the other side. Now the two people that you would have thought would have stopped for sure to help this man and would have been the priest and the Levite, because they were of the religious crowd. The priest represented the man in the pulpit. The Levite represented the man in the pew. As a matter of fact, since they were just coming from Jerusalem, it's very possible that they had just gotten out of church. But their problem was they did not want to get involved. Quite frankly, that attitude is not that unusual. Back in 1964, a young woman in her late 20s was attacked on her way home by a man who repeatedly stabbed her and took over a half hour to murder her. She screamed repeatedly for help, and at least 38 people looked down from their apartment window and watched the crime take place. Not one even bothered to telephone the police. When they were asked later why they had done nothing, they gave the famous response, "We just did not want to get involved." Jesus illustrates by what they did not do, that they were no better off than the thieves. You see, you can be a thief in one of two ways. A thief can take something that does not belong to him or keep something that belongs to someone else. Proverbs 3:27 says, "Do not withhold goods from those to whom it is due. When it is in the power of your hand to do so, never walk away from someone who deserves help." Your hand is God's hand for that person. Listen again to James 4:17. If you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, that for you is evil. You see, this is the problem. They could have done something. They could have told authorities that there was a man, that there was a person that needed help. They could have gone and gotten a doctor. Even in today's times, they could call 911, but they didn't do anything. I know many of you have heard, many in this room probably have heard of Art Linkletter, and some remember a program he used to have called House Party with the kids, and he would have little kids in there and would ask them questions. And he asked one little 5-year-old boy a question. He said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" He said, "I want to be a fireman so I can rescue people." Linkletter said, "Well, what would you do if there was a fire on the 4th floor of a hotel and you had a great big fat man down, and you had to get a great big fat man down?" The little boy said, "I'd get a gun with a rope on it, shoot it up to him so he could tie it around his waist, and he could jump out and pull himself down." You see, the problem with both the priest and the Levite is not what they did. They didn't beat the man up, and they didn't rob him. The problem was what they did not do. The quickest way to shut this church down, the quickest way you can kill a good church, and the quickest way you can make sure that you don't even have a church, is to just do nothing. When you see the offering box in the wall and you just pass it by. When the door of the worship is open and you pass it by. When the opportunity for ministry is available, you just pass it by. One of the greatest problems we have in most of our churches is that we have churches that are full of priests and Levites. Gallup survey discovered that only 10% of the American church members are active in any kind of personal ministry, and 50% of all church members have no interest in serving any ministry. In other words, 50% of the church is saying loudly and clearly, we just don't want to get involved. Now, these are the people, I'm not saying that about our church because I really feel like that's not our church, but these are statistics that I'm working off of. Now, these are the people who say, I do what I want to do. These are the people who say, I will only do what I have to do. I won't stick my neck out for anybody. And if you only do what you have to do in life, you're not a good neighbor. And the next one, Larry. The third, love. This is the third category crisis is making an issue here. Love. What is mine is yours. I will give it. There's one other figure in the story who, as you all know, is the hero. Verse 33. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. Now, when Jesus brings in the Samaritan in the parable, he not only poured it on, but he rubbed it in. When Jesus brought the Samaritan into the story, you could have heard a giant sucking sound all the way down to Egypt as people gasped when they heard him say, a certain Samaritan. You need to understand that today we talk about the Good Samaritan, but 2,000 years ago, the Jew felt the only good Samaritan was a dead Samaritan because they hated the Samaritans. There were several reasons. The Samaritans were Jews who, after Israel had been defeated by the Babylonians, stayed behind, intermarried with the Assyrians, who were an abomination in the sight of the Jews. They even built their own temple in Mount Gerizim and refused to worship in Jerusalem. If you really wanted to insult a person 2,000 years ago, all you had to call him was a Samaritan. That's why the Pharisee said to Jesus in John 8:48, do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Every morning in his daily prayer, a Pharisee would go to the temple and out loud thank God he had not been born a woman, a Gentile, or a Samaritan. Yet Jesus makes the Samaritan the hero of the story. Now, the reason he does this is to teach a lesson that the crowd that day, and maybe the crowd this day, never thought Jesus would teach. Not everybody understands the real meaning of this story. A little boy returned home from Sunday school, and his mother asked him what lesson the teacher had taught. He said it was about two preachers who saw a man in a ditch, but they didn't stop because he had already been robbed. So, actually, Jesus told the story to illustrate to the lawyer and to all that were listening that he had asked the wrong question. The question is not, who is my neighbor? Because he's going to see in a moment, you don't need to ask that question. The question is, am I a good neighbor? I mean, you put yourself in this story and ask yourself the question, be honest. Who would you have been that day? The thief, the priest, the Levite, or the Good Samaritan? You might be like the little girl who was in Sunday school class. The teacher was teaching the Good Samaritan story, and she said, now, if I saw a person lying in a ditch, beaten up, lying in his own blood, his teeth knocked out, and his scalp hanging in front of his head, what would you do? And the little girl spoke up and said, I think I'd throw up. Well, but now we begin to understand the meaning of the story. You see, everyone in your neighborhood, not just the person next door, is a neighbor. A neighbor is a needer. If a person is in need and you can meet that need, that person is your neighbor. Every time you see a person in need, you immediately become a neighbor if you become a minister with a ministry. The last three words of verse 33 tells us what set this Samaritan apart. He had compassion. You see, what made this Samaritan so special was not the color of his skin, but the compassion in his heart. No law could make the priest or the Levite stop, but love could make the Samaritan stop. You notice what the Samaritan did for this man. Verse 34, 35. And went to him and bandaged his wounds, poured on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." He probably tore his own robe to make bandages. He took oil and wine from his own supplies to use as medicine. Then he took him to an inn and paid for his upkeep. Now 2 denarii may not sound like much money to you, but it was 2 days' wages back then and would pay for 24 days of full room and board. A good neighbor is not concerned about cost. He is concerned about compassion. Now the crowd is already about to faint because of what Jesus said. Then Jesus drove the knife in all the way to the hilt. So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him? Who fell among the thieves? I'm sure the answer almost gagged the lawyer when he said, he who showed the mercy on him. Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Now we see the difference in the attitude of people and what makes a good neighbor. A good neighbor does not say, "Do what I want to do," or even "do what I have to do," but "do what I ought to do." So let me ask you a question. Are you a good neighbor? Are you yourself as a minister with a ministry? Do you have a ministry in the church, in this church? Do you have a ministry outside the church? Like a good neighbor, Jesus is there because the story because in the story, Jesus is the Good Samaritan. If you're like Jesus, you'll be a good neighbor too. There's a story about a man working in a shoe store in Europe. It was during the winter time, and he noticed a barefoot little boy standing in outside the baker shop next to the shoe store. He was trying to keep warm by standing on a grate, blowing hot air outside the bakery. Here was this shoe store owner surrounded by all of these shoes, but he was uncertain about what he ought to do about the little boy. All of a sudden, a middle-aged lady walked by. She bent down and spoke some kind words to the child, brought him into the store, bought him brand new shoes and socks. As the boy shivered in the cold, put on these warm shoes and socks, he said to the lady, "Are you God's wife?" She said, "No, son, I'm just one of his children." He smiled and said, "Well, I knew you must be kin to him somehow. When you get the Lord in your heart, you will get the love in your when you get the Lord in your heart, you will get the love in your heart. When you get the love in your heart, you realize everybody, regardless of their color, creed, race, or religion, is your neighbor. Just like Jesus, you'll be there." Thank you. Okay. Thank you for listening to me. It's I had a lot of trepidation, and I like to say it's my first time up here. I've stood in front of large galleries and sold material and given dissertations before. This is my church. This is different, okay? And I appreciate you being here. Pardon? Thank you. I love you all too, very much. I'd like to say a closing prayer, if it's okay. Our blessed Father, thank you for being with us. Thank you for being with us every second of every day. I just really don't know what I'd do without knowing that you're by my side. We have so many issues, Father, in this earth, but we have you to be there, and you're our rock and you're our salvation, and most of all, to me, you're my peace. No matter what's going on outside, no matter what's going on in my life, I know that there's peace there. All I have to do is consult you. I want to thank you for everything that you do and everything that you are. Please watch over us. Please watch over our government and take care of our church, Father. Help us to get back together and get back to the point where we feel really comfortable being in the church and having fellowship, Father. That's really a desire of mine. Thank you for all that you do and all you are. In Jesus Christ's most precious name, amen.